This episode of Nos Audietis is sponsored by Full Pull Wines, a Seattle-based wine retailer and proud sponsor of Nos Audietis since 2011. Full Pull was founded in 2009, is based in Seattle, and is owned and operated by longtime Sounders supporters. They offer the best boutique wines of the world to members of their mailing list, with special focus on their home, the Pacific Northwest.
Hey, this is Christian Roldan.
And Jordan Morris from the Seattle Sounders Football Club.
And you're listening to...
This is Nos Audietis.
Here we go. Come on! Hey, O'Shan! Let's go!
A sideline fry! The Seattle Sounders have done it! MLS Cup winners!
Here comes Rangers through the middle to crown it for Seattle! And now they truly can start the celebrations. It's the Sounders MLS Cup.
Nicola Dairon leaves absolutely no doubt! The Sounders rule the region!
Seattle Sounders, the greatest MLS team in history.
They've scored! They've scored! Finally!
This feels fucking awesome.
This is a tiny dog.
Is that what you young people call twerking?
And Portland can't say it's cheap.
We want to win. Let's see how the Sunday, bro.
Welcome to another edition of Nos Audietis, sponsored by Full Pull Wines, Watson's Counter, and our Substack subscribers. This is episode 383, and we're recording on Tuesday, April 17th, 2023. I am your host, Jeremiah Shan. Joining me today is Aaron Campo and our engineer, Lickett. So that happened. For the better part of 70 minutes, the Sounders basically controlled the match against the Portland Timbers and looked likely to end their three-game losing streak. But then Dairon Asprilla scored an admittedly impressive bicycle kick, revived the crowd, and sent a bolt of energy into the Timbers. 20 minutes later, they were 4-1 winners. It was the fourth straight time the Sounders had lost to the Timbers, the first time that's ever happened in the rivalry's history. The Timbers beat the Sounders by 3 goals for the second time in their last 3 meetings. A losing margin the Sounders have only suffered 2 other times since the start of 2019. They've now outscored the Sounders 11-2 in those 4 games, and the Sounders gave up more goals in that 20-minute span than they had in their previous 700 minutes this year. It was not surprising that Brian Spencer was about as mad as I've ever seen him in the postgame, saying he's not even sure if the Sounders can consider this a rivalry anymore. Aaron, what were your reactions at the time, and what do you think actually happened?
I mean, I was pissed off. I was extremely pissed off, as I think anybody who saw my tweets during the game could probably have guessed. I can definitely tell that I've grown up because the being pissed off only lasted for an hour or two. I was moved on to other things pretty quickly, but it's not. If you go to Portland and you lose 2-1 or 1-0 or what have you, it sucks, right? It's a bummer, but whatever. To go down there and lose that way after, like you said, they dominated for the first 70 minutes. I mean, that was like a consistent thought that I had was this Portland team is really bad. The Sounders have played pretty well, but they have not been able to get out of their own way in key moments. They've gotten pretty lucky with some shaky defending. This just does not feel like a game that should be this hard. And then Asprilla scores and it's off to the races from there. I don't know what happened, but it's clearly not to do with the talent levels of the teams involved. The Timbers are a bad team. They're a really bad team. For the first 70 minutes, they looked like total garbage. And they didn't even look that great for the last 20, 25 minutes. The Sounders just looked completely incapable of stopping them. And the Sounders, we know, are a good team. We've seen it all year. This is, up until this game, I would say the best Sounders team I've ever seen for, a run of 7 or 8 games. They've been incredible. And whatever it was not, I think, tactical, although I have some questions or concerns about some of the substitutions and the tactical shifts. But I think it's entirely mental. I think the Portland Timbers have gotten completely into the heads of the Sounders. we've talked this year a lot about how when the Sounders have conceded this year on the rare occasions that they have, or when they've had tough moments where they didn't convert open chances, we haven't seen their heads drop the way that they did at times last year. We haven't seen that lack of confidence. They haven't looked shell-shocked. They've always looked like a team that knew they could go and, get that chance and this time convert it, or not allow another goal and put the game out of reach. As soon as the Timbers scored, they looked like kids. They looked like, they just did not look like themselves at all.
It was a dramatic change in body language. It just was a dramatic change. And I do think there's something to be said about the way the goal happened was part of it. Like, it wasn't like there was this patient buildup and they got us or they got out. It was like, it wasn't this well-worked goal, really. It was just like a relatively mundane possession where, I saw some person actually suggested that that cross was mishit because there was someone at the back post that was looked more open, and Asprilla just kind of conjured this out of thin air. I mean, that's an amazing goal. He had two guys basically sandwiched around him.
He did have to kick one of them in the face to score, which
he didn't actually make contact with Alex Rodon. It should be said. I know a lot of people were up in arms and said that should have been a high boot, but I gotta admit, I don't think.
I think that it probably should be, but it's never ever going to be called. If you
make that kind of contact on it, if he misses the ball, it's a dangerous play. But if you score it, you're gonna get the benefit of the doubt.
Yeah, fair enough.
But I think it was to some degree. I think it was how it happened. But something else I've found myself thinking about, and I don't know, curious your thoughts on this. In a way, I almost would just as well them lose this game 4-1, and it just be this absolute gut, like just a total shot to the jaw, like Brian Schmetzer said that today. That's almost better than if they had lost this 2-1. Like where it was like really just sort of a gut punch. Like, I'm thinking of the last time they played at Providence where they lost 2-1. They had scored the first goal, but they were really sort of never in the game. They had a chance to equalize, like on Jackson Reagan had an open header that I think he hit off the crossbar, maybe hit it over. But I'd almost take this kind of loss because you can't ignore it. You can't write it off. You have to almost be like, you have to face it head on, and it like, hopefully is a shock to the system, and they come out just hair on fire, and hopefully they go into the next game on a 4-game winning streak or however many games are until the next one.
Yeah, I mean that is a possibility. Another possibility is it's like last year where the Sounders came into the game against Portland and they looked like they'd kind of turned it around, put the slow league start behind them, and then they got walloped at home and looked like crap the rest of the year. And that's my concern. And it was the concern I had with the way that game unfolded, is that they just looked like they had fully reverted to a bad team for 25 minutes. And, if that stays at 25 minutes, okay, not the biggest deal in the world. But if it carries over, if there's a hangover effect, if there was a dent in the confidence that can't be repaired by a good week in training, I think that's where it becomes a bigger concern.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose that's a good way of putting it. Like, if they come back and they beat Minnesota this week, I think it's maybe not easy to like not be worried about this last game. But if there is a if they don't win this game, then it does sort of like linger around, and that's going to be very uncomfortable and very bad. Now, I will say, there was some mitigating circumstances around this, and keeping in mind that Portland had their own list of mitigating circumstances as well. There's a good chance that next time the Sounders play Portland, they'll have a couple more pieces. But I didn't really think this was a talent issue before. I don't think it's a talent issue now. But that Christian Roldan was a last-minute scratch. He had been training with the starters all week, and that Albert Rusnak was out. I think those two absences were both really significant. And I almost would say either one of those players being on the field might have themselves really avoided that collapse because of what both of those players do so well.
Yeah, I think that either of those guys missing is a huge problem. Both of them missing is a bigger problem. I think Atencio missing was a big deal as well.
Yeah.
And I think I was extremely hard on Yamar's performance during the game, and I do think that it was as bad as I've ever seen him play. By a pretty significant margin. But I don't think it's an accident that the game that he looked that bad, so uncharacteristically out of sorts, was the game where Roldan, Rusnak, and Atencio were all missing. Like, I do think that it was one of those things where just a bunch of little to medium-sized problems compounded and turned into the kind of fiasco that we saw.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's fair, and it should be said, Obed, I thought, actually played pretty well. I don't think he was the main problem, and he had a great assist. It should also be said.
Yes.
So I suppose you could argue that they don't score that goal if Obed is in there. I don't necessarily think that they wouldn't have scored, but Obed was good. I thought he was probably one of the bright spots in the game.
Yeah, I mean, it is kind of a funny one where the guy that isn't usually in the team wasn't the problem, and it was a lot of guys who are ordinarily in the team,
right.
But missing those three players was clearly an impact, even though it wasn't Vargas that was the problem.
And Obed does different things than than Rusnak. Rusnak is much more of a player who is going to help you in possession. And the Sounders dominated possession in this game, but it's the way that they, Mark Kastner, who you may remember from the last episode of No Sadietes, had a great observation this last week where he was saying that one of the problems the Sounders had was they weren't able to really create a rest defense. And by that, he means being able to sort of defend with the ball by just holding on to it. Like, especially after that first goal, that's what they needed to do. They needed to be able to just not give the ball away. That doesn't mean they had to stop attacking, but it does mean that they needed to just be smart, to not give the ball away, to not let Portland get out in transition, something they had done a wonderful job of for the first 70 minutes. And then all of a sudden, towards the end of the game, it was just like, it was a free for all.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that the thing that's so frustrating about the way this game went is that the first 70 minutes before the Asprilla goal looked, I think, similar-ish to the Galaxy game without the final product, where it's not like the Sounders were at their very, very sharpest,
right?
But they were in control. They were a team that felt they had the talent edge. They had the game under control. They knew before Ruidíaz scored, they knew they were going to score. They were doing all the things they'd done well so far this year, just not quite as sharply. And I think in a rivalry game, that's kind of to be expected. I think it's really hard to be completely sharp in a game where the emotions are really high. They tend to be a little more physical, all those factors, right? And then last 20 minutes, I mean, just completely uncharacteristic. All of the little problems that they had over last year that, plagued them through various times throughout the season all happened at the same time, like 10 times worse. And it was just so baffling to see, because it's just, even when the Sounders have been bad in the past, they very rarely have been shambolic. And this was as bad as I've ever seen them look.
I haven't confirmed this, but my suspicion is that they probably had never given up 4 goals in 18 minutes. I would hope not. Right, exactly. I mean, it's a lot of goals to give up in a small amount of time.
Right.
And so, and to your point, like, it's just not, like, teams don't do that. They especially don't do that in, like, good teams don't do it. They especially don't do it in games where they have otherwise been dominating. It's just not a thing that happens for the most part.
Right.
And I would imagine it probably won't ever happen again, or at least not for the foreseeable future. So there was an element of flukiness to it that you can't ignore. But whether they gave up 4 goals or if they gave up 2 goals, it's still like they still just stopped playing their game for the last 20 minutes. And I think there's been rightfully a lot of focus on the decision that immediately almost exactly immediately preceded the collapse, and that was removing Leo Chu and replacing him with Hebert. And Brian Spencer talked about it after the game. He talked about it again today at training, and I think his thinking is not crazy. There was some logic behind it. He basically figured, look, we did this against St. Louis. It was a similar. He said it was 1-0. It was not 1-0. It was 2-0.
Mhm.
He also did it later in the game. It was the 83rd minute. It wasn't the 70th minute or the 68th minute, actually. If you
It was
want
at
to
home.
It was at home. It was not against an opponent who had beat you 3 straight times.
Right.
It was against an expansion team who I think was rightfully maybe not like you could rely you could especially they were down 2-0. There's just a lot of variables that were different, but he liked how they looked in that game, and in his mind it was like, this is us going for the kill. It's better to get another goal than to just try to close this game out. And I guess that thinking isn't totally out of whack, but it just seems like the smart move, especially with how you're dominating,
Right.
especially given that Rui Diaz was apparently on a pitch count, essentially. Pull out Rui Diaz and replace him with Hebert, and just keep doing what you're doing. Like, you don't have to. There's no need to change your formation. There's no need to change up your I don't know. It just seems like it just was sort of aggressive for the sake of being aggressive.
Yeah.
And it clearly didn't work.
Yeah, I 100% agree. I felt that way at the time. It just seemed like what the Sounders were doing was working so well. And that's
Right.
the thing, is it's like, if you feel like you need another goal and you can't create, and you're not creating chances, and you don't feel like you're going to be able to do that, that's one thing. But the Sounders were having their way with the Timbers. I mean, the first 15, 20 minutes of the second half were dominance. I mean, it looked like what we've seen a lot this year, and we talked about a lot in the St. Louis game, where the Sounders spent the first half kind of feeling out their opponent, and the second half made adjustments, came out guns blazing. And I think to so drastically change up the system, especially against the team, and I think this is a really key thing as well, the Timbers like to counter. They scored more or less all 4 of their goals on counters. And that's not, St. Louis is a counter pressing team. It's a much
Totally different, yes,
approach. And taking off a vertical threat in behind in Leo Chu, putting on, I mean, Hebert is a great player, but he's not the guy I want. I don't want him and Rui Diaz on the pitch at the same time against a team that likes to counter, especially when you've lost like some of your verticality, especially when you've lost some width. I think that that's a substitution that makes sense in other circumstances and is baffling to me in this one. And it's pretty rare that Brian Schmetzer makes decisions that, even when they don't work out, I can usually say, I understand the thought process here, and I think it's a thought process that makes sense. I think you do a good job of laying out what he was thinking, but it doesn't make sense to me. And
yeah, I agree. And I would like to think that if he had to do it over again, he would have made the straightforward substitution that was just like sitting there.
Right.
And you didn't have to do something like he said, like, maybe we just lock it down and we get to the 80th minute, and if we're still up 1-0, we bring in Javi for Leo. And I suppose that would be another way you could do that. I don't think and I suppose maybe that was he didn't really spell this out, but maybe he did mean it in a way that was like what I said, which is you just get yourself to the 80. Maybe you move Hebert in for Rui Diaz, and then if you get to the 80th minute, then you kind of start playing with your formation. You put a more defensive formation, you protect against the counter, you do all these kind of things. But I'll also point out the other thing that made that 4-4-2 decision so odd is that they had already sort of made a gamble in the starting lineup where and this is something that we had talked about, I think we've talked about on the show before, is the reason that we hadn't really seen Chu, Rui Diaz, and Morris before was because that's a really different tactical capacity than if it's Roldan, Morris, and Chu, or Roldan, Rui Diaz, and Morris.
Right.
Roldan being the key there, or Rusnak. You could put either Roldan or Rusnak, because essentially what they're able to do is act as they're able to sort of pinch in and act as like a fourth central midfielder. And so without Roldan or Rusnak on the pitch, you were already playing with one less sort of like central midfielder, someone capable of clogging up the midfield. Then that's part of why they've been so good at protecting against the counter, is this kind of ability to play. And so he sort of doubled down on that by taking off another. So by essentially now you're asking Morris to essentially have to behave as that other player. You also are pulling Ladero out of his central role and you're pushing him out to the wing, and you've sort of created this big void, or you're asking Hebert to defend like a 10. And I don't think that's not going to be his strong suit. That's not, you want him chasing down, you want him to be maybe counter-pressing some, but he's not going to offer you a lot of set defending.
Yeah, yes, exactly. I think that's a more robust way of saying what I was trying to say, with like, it's just such a weird against a team like the Timbers, who the one thing they can do is run straight. to put your players in a position like that, where, and I do think that, I don't want to play armchair psychologist again. I tend to try to avoid doing that, but I've done it like 5 shows in a row now. But maybe the thought process is that, you know what, we've lost 3 in a row to these guys. I would like to get back to beating them like we used to, especially at their own place. And they're there for the taking. Let's go out and get another 2-3 goals. And that's like, I understand the emotion of that, right? Like I would always want the Sounders to be aggressive against Portland when the game is there for the taking, but I don't know. Without putting themselves in a position to get cut apart like that. And again, I think like we can analyze the tactics and see reasons that the Sounders became more vulnerable after those substitutions. I think there's a lot more going on here. So I don't want to say this is all because they made this tactical switch, but I do think it made what happened a lot more. I think it opened the door for what happened to happen.
Yeah. And I will say I got into sort of a lengthy discussion with someone on Twitter about how much, whether or not that first goal, how directly tied it was to the sub. And, I guess there's a case to be made for it. I don't necessarily buy like ultimately it was a great goal that came out of almost nothing. The Sounders had the numbers to defend it. Could they have, but maybe the sub made it a little bit more likely that it could happen because there was just one fewer player there to kind of defend it. But either way, I'm with you. I don't think that the subs are the main culprit, or the sub was the main culprit, but it made it go from a very unlikely scenario to maybe a unlikely scenario.
Yeah.
And it came good, and it still is awful. I should also say that the atmosphere, the other thing that just killed me about the way that goal changed the game, was the atmosphere had really died down a lot. Like it was bordering on like almost quiet at times from the point that the Sounders scored until the point that Asprilla scored. And that from that point forward, it was just mayhem. It was so loud. There was just energy in the building that just wasn't there. And that's why I say that I think it really had something to do with the type of goal it was, and not just it just being another goal.
Yeah, totally agree. And I think, that's like, that is kind of all of those factors that played into this happening. Most of them in the Sounders' control, whether tactically or just the performances on the pitch. But when you allow a goal to be scored like that, you are going to let the crowd back into it, especially when it's an equalizer. If the Sounders had gone up 2-0, like they probably should have a couple minutes earlier,
that's a good point.
The crowd is still going to come alive, but it's not going to be the same, right? But then to let the crowd get back into it, what you have to do there, because I think you're right that goal is just one of those things where you kind of have to just take it, right? You just kind of have to live with it. It's a great goal. I don't think like you said, that the substitution formation change really had all that much to do with that goal in particular. It's really the next three that I think are more, that maybe where that's more to blame. But instead of the Sounders doing what they've kind of done this year, which is just kind of taking it all in stride and going out and doing their thing, they let the crowd get to them. They let the moment get to them, and it just snowballed from there. And it's, I keep saying it, but I just don't get it, because it's not what we've seen from them this year.
Yeah, I would totally agree with her. Well, I think this is probably a good place to call this, or I take it back. We're going to take a break, and we're going to come back, talk a little bit more about, the other goals after the first one, talk a little bit about what we liked from the formation that the Sounders started with, and a few other things. And you're listening to Nos Audiates. If you hooligans don't know Watson's Counter by now, then it must be really nice living under that rock. Watson's Counter is a top-tier coffee roaster bringing light roasts that would impress your most annoyingly pretentious coffee friend while maintaining the approachability of a golden doodle. I, Jeremiah Oshan, am notorious for chowing down on their Korean-inspired brunch, sipping on an insanely delicious latte, and hitting on their super handsome owner. Okay. Visit their website at www.watsonscounter.com or follow them on Instagram to stay up to date with all the latest announcements, such as their coffee brewing classes. This episode of Nos Audiates is sponsored by Full Pull Wines, a Seattle-based wine retailer and proud sponsor of Nos Audiates since 2011. The team at Full Pull tastes hundreds of wines each month. The best of those are included in their carefully curated once daily email offers. Joining the Full Pull email list is free, and there are no obligations to buy. If you read about a wine you like, you make a request. The wine then arrives at their warehouse, where you can either pick it up or have it shipped to you directly. They also do tastings at their warehouse, which is located in Soto Urban Works, a complex that includes numerous other tasting rooms like Lot of Wines, Roadie Cellars, and Sleight of Hand, as well as pizzas and salads at 9 Pies. If you're interested in joining their mailing list or learning more about them, visit fullpullwines.com. Welcome back to Nos Audiates. So there were a few more things I wanted to get into before we, move on to the next game. So I wanted to unpack some of the other goals, specifically, especially the first two, because I think those were the two that happened when it was still a game. I'm willing to sort of write off the fourth one a little bit because it was sort of out of hand at that point, and there was a lot of things that I don't think I'm worried about, or the things that happen on that one I'm not as worried about. The second and third, though, warrant some discussion. On the second one, basically it was a turnover that then is compounded by Obed first taking sort of a bad angle, Yamar then taking a bad angle, and Reagan, I don't know, I'm inclined to say he was a little caught out, but he was maybe in a no-win situation there, and he was basically in a foot race with a guy who's going to beat him. And Fagasha ends up hitting a shot that Fry gets an arm on, but I don't really blame him for not saving. That was just bad defending. Just classic bad defending.
Yeah, we saw a lot of that over the last 20-25 minutes, and people were very hard on Stephen Fry in this game, and we'll definitely
we'll talk about
get
that
to
too.
That. But I do think that a constant theme in this game was just in the last 20 minutes. It felt like a lot longer than 20 minutes, but it really only was 20 minutes. Was just the Sounders just not stopping the guys who that's their whole job to do, is to stop them, or at least put them in like a slightly more difficult position. It just felt like the Timbers were kind of allowed to do whatever they wanted to. And yeah, it was Reagan and Yamar have been lights out this year. Reagan looks like the second coming of Chad Marshall, but with even more mobility, and Yamar has looked like, the best version of himself that we've seen. And it was just like they completely forgot how to play. And I think no more was it just sort of baffling, like you just kind of stopped playing defense than on that second goal.
Yeah. And then on the third goal is the one where I think Fry is getting really lit up for, and rightfully so. Basically, it's a shot that is not like there's some traffic, but it, watching the replay, I think Fry saw it. And he just pops it up in the air. Like he just leaves it. He looks like he just awkwardly sort of like volleyballs it away. But what makes it even worse is that there are 3 Timbers closer to the rebound than any Sounders. No Sounders are reacting to the shot at all. And he manages to save the first rebound, but then Niezgoda is just there to sort of tap it in. And I'm definitely and I think maybe part of the reason that there was no defenders there is that it looked like the kind of thing that a goalkeeper catches, or at least puts it wherever they want.
Yeah, it was really an uncharacteristic lack of situational awareness by Stefan Fry to not do pretty much any other thing with that shot. And we've been pretty consistent defenders of Stefan Fry, and I think that I still think he's clearly the best option at goalkeeper, but I mean, there's no defending that play. That's a really, really, that's a howler. That's the definition of a howler to let that in. And if I have any, I don't know, if there's anything positive to take away from it, it's that, well, that's not a situation where he's not reacting quickly enough, or he's not, I don't know. Some people were saying that they think he like has bad vision, and we're saying that pretty earnestly. I don't feel like that. I don't know. I mean, maybe that's the problem. I don't know. But
I mean, it seems like it would be showing itself in more.
Right. I think that it was just a goof up at a really bad time. And I don't know. I mean, there's nothing really else to say about it. And I think the frustrating thing about it is that it seemed like the reaction of a player who was very flustered by bad circumstances. Now, he was put into, like, he wasn't screened and he had a clear line of sight, but the defense let him down there in that situation. He should get a lot of blame for that. He did really poorly on that play, but it's not like everybody else did their job really well.
No, right. I think that's an important thing here. Is it's sort of like in the same way that the second goal happens, where there's all these cascading errors.
Right.
Like there's just no reason that 3 Timbers should be the closest to the rebound. Like that's just not. That can't be the way you're reacting defensively. And I think what, I guess to put it into better context or fuller context, is I think what people are worried about is that Fry now has given up 3 goals where he's left a rebound. I will, and I don't, like the other 2 are not great either, but they're much more excusable.
Yeah.
Like they're much more in the range of, look, goalkeepers aren't going to punch a rebound exactly where they want it to go every single time. So sometimes that's going to happen, right? Like that's like you take enough shots, there's going to be some rebounds that don't go where you want them to go. I'm not ready to proclaim that Fry is just routinely giving up bad rebounds, but this one does, when you give up one like this, it starts to put the other ones in much starker contrast.
I definitely think that this one was as bad as people have acted like the other ones were. Like,
yes.
and that's like, at least one of the other ones he made, I think, a really good save, and there's no way he's doing anything but getting a hand on it to stop it. I don't really understand how you can blame that on him. It's like, yeah, he got to the ball, but that's all he could have hoped to do. One of the other ones wasn't quite that bad, but it was a much less clear cut. That is a ball you catch, or at least parry over goal or well out of harm's way, rather than just sort of, I mean, at the time, it almost looked like he had it and dropped it.
Right.
And that's a whole different, I think, class of bad error. And I mean, the only concern I have with it long term is that, like, whether or not it's affecting his confidence.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
That can happen with keepers, even keepers as well established as Stephen Fry. Now that he does have 3 goals, that whether or not all 3 of them were, quote, his fault, unquote, that can't feel great from his perspective. So that's my only real concern with that one long term. But I do think he had a poor game overall. Like, I think the thing that is, I think, a little strange to me is that, and I think it's common that this happens, where when the Sounders give up goals and look bad defensively, people spend a lot more time talking about Stephen Fry than the defense.
Yeah.
And I think the defense had a much, like, Reagan and Yamar had a much worse game than Stephen Fry did.
Yeah, I would tend to agree with that. And that sort of leads into this next question, though. Was anyone bad enough in this game? Like, the most stable part of the Sounders roster or lineup has been the back 5. Nuhu didn't play one game. I guess it was the same game that Roldan didn't start, right? Yeah, they both didn't start the same game. But in 7 of the 8 games, they've had the exact same back 5. Did anyone play bad enough that you don't think they should be starting against Minnesota?
With the context of the rest of the season, I don't think so. And especially given the way the game unfolded, I think Yamar looked shaky all night, but everyone else, I think, looked fine until things got out of hand.
Yeah.
And if the defense had been so-so this year and then that happened, I think maybe that's a question you have to think a little bit harder about. But the defense has been one of the best parts of the team this year until that 20 minutes. And so I don't think that, unless it does seem like it had a lasting impact on somebody's confidence, I don't think that you can, make a change to what's been a really effective unit based on that one game. Especially considering all the changes upstream, like all the changes to the midfield that Sounders had to kind of change the way that they played, and all that can have cascading effects. But I definitely think another shaky performance, and you've got to consider benching, whoever has that shaky performance, if for no other reason than to just get them out of their own heads.
Yeah. I think that's probably fair. I actually it was before the goal. One of the sort of like talking points I had in my head was this Alex Roldan Dairon Asprilla battle is really entertaining.
Yeah.
Like, they were going at it. And I mean, I'm guessing Roldan gives up 20 or 30 pounds to Asprilla. Is a big guy.
He's a big dude. Yeah.
And they were battling. They were having quite a battle. I was very impressed with Alex Roldan. Now, I think you can definitely argue he sort of gets posterized a little bit there on the bicycle kick. Not necessarily his fault, but he's in the frame.
Yeah, very much so.
That's sort of what happens. And so I didn't have any fault with him really at all. I mean, like, he was the least of their defensive problems, I think. And Nuhu similarly, like, it was not Nuhu's best game, but I still really think he's done great. So this really comes down to, does Yamar or Jackson potentially need a day off? Does Fry potentially need a day off? I don't think I'm there either. I don't think any of them are quite there, but hopefully they do well against Minnesota and we put this all to bed and whatever. But I suppose it's worth asking. So the final thing I wanted to talk about today is to end on a little bit more of a positive note. I was, like I said earlier in the show, I maybe not skeptical, but I understood why the Sounders had not previously used that front 3 that they used, even though it seemed like the obvious way to get all 3 of these players who everyone seems to want to see on the field together. And I don't think it worked great, but it worked reasonably well. Like, they were, like, I think we saw both Morris and Chu able to stretch the defense. They were both getting good opportunities coming off the wings. And Rui Diaz was he had a heavy touch a few times. He wasn't as sharp as, his best version, but he also scored a perfectly, vintage-esque Rui Diaz goal where he just kind of swipes it into the goal from 14 yards out or whatever. And all in all, I thought it was a pretty good look. Now, I'm not necessarily saying we should use that against Minnesota, but I liked it.
Yeah, I thought that it was effective. I think that it opened up some problems later on when you didn't have more of a box-to-box type player on the wing.
Yeah.
But that's a different, that's a whole different ball of wax, right? And I think in general, they created chances. I like Morris and Chu obviously worked really well with Chu on the left, Morris in the center. But I kind of like having guys on both wings that can stretch the defense a lot, and Rui Diaz, sort of dropping into the midfield a little bit more. And, I like that look. I think it can be effective definitely against certain opponents. I think weirdly it does kind of work against the Timbers because you can just kind of tell the fullbacks to stay at home a little bit more and try to be a little more vertical. You run into some width problems, I guess, when you actually get into the attack and you aren't able to create chances from a counter, but it's fun to watch and it can be really effective. So I think that there are opponents that can work against. I definitely think it's a look that you could see the Sounders going to later in games, whether they're chasing a goal or just want somebody to run at tired fullbacks. I thought it looked great. And, I think I'm with you in that I don't think that this is a look the Sounders need to try to make work necessarily. I think if Christian is healthy, he should probably be back on the right and Jordan should probably be back on the left or in the middle, although that seems unlikely still. But it was definitely, I think I was similarly a little bit skeptical about it just because it's such a different look. They don't have that box to box player on the wing and Christian Roldan. There's definitely promise to it.
So that does bring up an interesting lineup question this week is what would you, I guess my suspicion is that Brian is going to have to choose one of these three setups. It's either going to be Chu, Morris, and Rusnak across the front with Vargas and JP sitting beneath, or he's going to go JP and Rusnak with Morris, Rui Diaz, and Chu. Which of those two lineups, I guess, is there a third setup that I'm missing that's rather obvious?
Well, it's Christian out for sure.
Christian is probably, my assumption is Christian, he's still in concussion protocol. Yeah. He would have to be cleared to train probably tomorrow, which I suppose could happen, but I don't. He might be available. My suspicion is he's not going to start.
Yeah, sure. You don't want to rush him back, so that totally makes sense. I think, I don't know. It's tough because I did like some things about that front three that we just talked about, and I do think that Rusnak works really well in the midfield, as we've kind of talked about, a lot this season. I think that's probably my preference.
To see Rusnak back in the midfield. Yeah.
I also can understand why there might be a little bit of gun shyness after the way the last game went with going with that kind of an aggressive lineup. And,
it's at home though.
True. I think it wouldn't be a concern I would have, but I can see it being a concern.
Yeah. I'm sure it's a concern. I'm sure it's going to be debated ad nauseum. But I also wonder if there is we've kind of been talking about this. So you guys talked about it a lot last week. Is there is a point where you're sort of benching Rui Diaz, and at some point you can just be like, we're going to keep benching him and see if we can just get something more out of him by benching him, I suppose.
Right.
But it does feel like you're maybe reaching the extent of how far you can push that before it's like, look, if you're not going to start me, what are we doing here?
Right. Especially since he's scoring, right?
Especially since he's scoring. And at some point you do have once they're fully healthy, they're, or I don't know, I guess that's more of a theoretical conundrum, right. But it is an issue they're going to have to deal with at some point. But Yeah, I'm with you though. I think if I have to pick the lineup, I think I would rather have Rusnak back next to João Paulo
Yep.
and let Morris roll Don or Morris Chu and Rui Diaz take another shot, especially against a Minnesota team who is going to give up possession. They're probably going to try to frustrate you.
Yeah.
And
I would
if you
imagine
can
so.
stretch them out, that's probably a good way to break them down.
Yeah. And I mean, it's not something the Sounders have necessarily had a ton of trouble with this year, but it is something that they have kind of historically had some trouble with is breaking down those teams. So I think that having that creativity back a line is going to be helpful.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think that's probably a good place to call it. We are going to be doing a question and answer show. Look for that in your feed probably in a day or so. But yeah, other than that, I suppose it's time to bid you all farewell. Thank you to our sponsors, Full Pull Wines, Watson's Counter, and a huge thank you to all our paid Substack subscribers. If you are a listener to this show and you want to support what we're doing, I would really urge you to check out our Substack. That's nosodietis.substack.com. And if you want to become a paid subscriber of that, we'd very much appreciate it. There are a few perks that come along with that. And those are things that are going to be developing in the coming weeks and months. And I would hope that folks are finding value in that. So, thank you to everyone who has been helping us out and making this a fun and ongoing endeavor. With all that said, I am Jeremiah Shan, signing off for Aaron Campo and Lickett. This is Nos Adietes. Remember, you will never yet alone.